His throne was a dangerous illusion. Isabella Moretti knew that love had no place in their world. But she had loved him anyway, before duty tore them apart. Now, years later, he stood before her, no longer a soldier, but a king. And when her father offered her hand in marriage to a man she did not know, did not want, it was him who spoke first. "She's not marrying him," he said, his voice calm, final. Her father laughed. "And why is that?" He tilted his head, his golden gaze locking onto hers. "Because she's still mine." Chapter 1. The reappearance of a ghost. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, the scent of expensive perfume and old money, it was all a suffocating blanket over Isabella Moretti. She stood by the grand window of her father's study, overlooking the sprawling gardens of their Long Island estate, a glass of untouched champagne trembling slightly in her hand. 58 years. 58 years she had lived, and most of them felt like a carefully constructed performance, a role she played to perfection for the sake of her family, the Famiglia. Tonight was no different. Another gathering of the New York Five families, another display of power and veiled threats disguised as social pleasantries. Her father, Don Lorenzo Moretti, a man whose silver hair and sharp blue eyes still commanded respect and fear in equal measure, was holding court in the center of the room. He was discussing business with Don Angelo Vitali, a man whose girth suggested a fondness for cannoli and whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Isabella had learned to read the subtle cues, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the fleeting glances that betrayed the true nature of these gatherings. Tonight, the tension was thicker than usual. Something was brewing, something that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She'd spent years after her husband, Marco, had died a car accident, they'd said, though she'd always suspected otherwise, trying to carve out a small space for herself, a life beyond the suffocating expectations of the Famiglia. She'd found solace in her small bookstore in the village, a haven filled with the scent of old paper and the quiet rustle of turning pages. A world away from this. A shadow fell across her, and she turned, her heart giving a painful lurch. It was Alessandro.
Alessandro Bianchi.
Not the boy she had known, the boy she had loved, with a fierce, forbidden passion. This was a man, hardened, his face etched with lines that spoke of battles fought and won, his eyes, the same startling gold, now held a depth of something she couldn't quite decipher. It was like looking at a familiar landscape after a devastating storm. The landmarks were there, but everything was irrevocably changed. He hadn't aged in the way she expected. The youthful softness was gone, replaced by a chiseled jawline and a presence that radiated power. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, his impeccably tailored suit hinting at the strength beneath. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator's elegance, that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. A flicker of recognition. A spark of the embers that had never truly died. "Isabella," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. It was a voice that had haunted her dreams for decades, a voice that had whispered promises in the dark, promises that had been shattered by the cruel realities of their world. She managed a small, tight smile.
Alessandro.
"It's been a long time." 30 years, he said, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer pleasantries, didn't pretend this was a casual encounter.
"You haven't changed."
It was a lie, of course. They had both changed. She saw it in the way he held himself, in the guarded look in his eyes. She felt it in the hollow ache in her chest, in the way her breath caught in her throat. She had changed, hardening into a shell that few could penetrate. He wasn't a part of her life anymore. She thought she had finally buried that part of her. "Neither have you," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. She took a sip of her champagne, the bubbles suddenly flat and tasteless. He inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Perhaps not on the surface. The unspoken words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their shared past, a past filled with stolen moments, whispered secrets, and the crushing weight of family expectations. He had been her father's most trusted soldier, a young man destined for greatness within the Famiglia. She had been the Don's daughter, promised to another, a pawn in the intricate game of power and alliances. Their love had been a flame in the darkness, fierce and bright, but ultimately doomed. Her father had made sure of that. He'd sent Alessandro away, a mission to Italy, a task designed to keep him away from her, to break the bond that threatened to disrupt his carefully laid plans. She had received a single, heartbreaking letter, a farewell scrawled in hurried ink, and then silence. She had married Marco, borne him 2 children, played the dutiful wife. And Alessandro had become a legend, a whisper in the shadowed corners of their world. He had risen through the ranks, becoming a force to be reckoned with, a man even her father now treated with a cautious respect. He was now Don Alessandro Bianchi, the head of his own family, and his presence tonight was a deliberate flex. Their conversation was interrupted by her father's booming voice.
Alessandro, good to see you. Come, join us.
Alessandro gave Isabella one last, lingering look, a look that sent a shiver of unease and something else, something dangerously close to hope, spiraling through her. Then, he turned and walked towards her father, leaving her standing alone by the window, the ghost of his presence still lingering in the air, the taste of forgotten dreams bitter on her tongue. The unsettling feeling that had been building all evening intensified, a knot forming in her stomach. She had a feeling that Alessandro's return was not a coincidence, and that whatever was about to happen would change her life forever. She looked back out the window, the meticulously kept gardens blurring with the threat of rain clouds. It felt like a storm that had been brewing for decades was finally about to break. Chapter 2. A marriage proposal refused. The air in the study thickened as Alessandro approached. He moved with that same unsettling grace, a panther navigating a room full of wary prey. Isabella watched, a detached observer from her window perch, as he clasped her father's hand in a firm grip, the gesture a blend of respect and defiance. Don Vitale eyed Alessandro with a mixture of suspicion and grudging admiration. The dynamics were clear. Lorenzo, the aging lion, still powerful but aware of the shifting tides, Vitale, the opportunistic hyena, circling, waiting for a chance to strike, and Alessandro, the young tiger, claiming his territory. "It's good to see you, Alessandro," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying the weight of years of command. "It's been too long." "Indeed, Don Lorenzo," Alessandro replied, his golden eyes flickering towards Isabella for the briefest of moments. "Business has kept me occupied." The business was, of course, the brutal and intricate world of the Mafia. The consolidation of power, the forging of alliances, the constant threat of betrayal. Isabella knew it all too well, even though she tried to distance herself from it. It was the air she breathed, the water she swam in, inescapable. "And what brings you here tonight, Alessandro?" Vitale interjected, his voice smooth, but edged with steel. "Surely not just to reminisce with old friends." Alessandro turned his attention to Vitale, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I heard there was a celebration. A proposal, perhaps?" Lorenzo cleared his throat. "Yes, as a matter of fact. I was about to announce it." He turned to the assembled guests, raising his glass. "My friends, I have some joyous news. To strengthen the bonds between our families, I have decided to offer my daughter Isabella's hand in marriage to Don Angelo Vitale's son, Marco." The room erupted in polite applause, but Isabella felt a cold dread wash over her. Marco Vitale Jr., he was a younger, crueler version of his father, a man known for his ruthlessness and his appetites. The thought of being bound to him, of being subjected to his touch, made her stomach churn. She had endured one loveless marriage for the sake of the Famiglia, she wouldn't endure another. She wouldn't. She saw the smug look on Vitale's face, the predatory gleam in his son's eyes as he looked at her from across the room. It was a power play, a way to consolidate the Vitale family's influence, and she was the pawn. Before she could formulate a response, before the polite applause died down, Alessandro spoke. His voice was calm, almost casual, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "She's not marrying him," he said. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Alessandro, then to Lorenzo, the tension palpable. Lorenzo's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of barely controlled fury. "And why is that, Alessandro?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Alessandro didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze locking onto Isabella's. The connection between them was electric, a silent conversation passing between them, a mixture of defiance, protectiveness, and something that made her heart ache with a long-dormant longing. He tilted his head, a gesture that was both arrogant and mesmerizing. "Because she's still mine." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a declaration, a promise. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope for it. It was madness, reckless, dangerous. But it was also exhilarating. Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You're mistaken, Alessandro. Isabella is a widow. She's free to marry whomever I choose." "You broke a vow, Lorenzo," Alessandro said, his voice hardening. 30 years ago, you promised her to me. You sent me away, thinking you could erase what was between us. You were wrong." The room was utterly silent now, the guests frozen in place, witnessing a confrontation that could shatter the fragile peace between the families. Isabella felt a strange mix of terror and elation. She was caught in the crossfire, but for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Lorenzo's face was a mask of rage. That was a childish infatuation. "This is business. This is about the future of our families." "And what about Isabella's future?" Alessandro asked, his voice laced with steel. "Does she have no say in this? Does her happiness mean nothing?" Lorenzo waved his hand dismissively. "She understands her duty."
Duty?
Alessandro's voice was edged with scorn. "You speak of duty, yet you're willing to sacrifice your own daughter to a man like Vitali. A man who will use her, break her." Isabella saw the flicker of doubt in her father's eyes, the momentary hesitation. He knew, deep down, that Alessandro was right. But pride, the ingrained belief in the old ways, wouldn't let him back down. "This is none of your concern, Alessandro," Lorenzo said, his voice tight with anger. Alessandro took a step closer to Lorenzo, his presence dominating the room. "It is my concern. I made a vow to protect her, and I intend to keep it, even if it means going to war with you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. The possibility of a war between the Moretti and Bianchi families was a terrifying prospect, one that could plunge the city into chaos. Isabella knew she had to do something to defuse the situation before it escalated beyond control. She stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. "Father," she said, "I appreciate your concern for my future, but I will not marry Marco Vitali. I will not be a pawn in your games." Her words were met with stunned silence. She had defied her father, publicly, in front of the entire famiglia. It was an act of rebellion she hadn't thought herself capable of, but Alessandro's presence, his unwavering support, had given her the courage she needed. She felt a sense of liberation, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The weight of expectation, the suffocating pressure of tradition, seemed to lift, if only for a moment. She looked at Alessandro and saw the glimmer of approval in his eyes. He was dangerous, a wild card in a game that had been playing in the same manner for 500 years. But even the Don's daughter could appreciate the chaos he had just unleashed. She wondered if she would come to regret this moment. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. The silence that followed Isabella's declaration was thick with unspoken recriminations. Lorenzo's face was a study in controlled fury, his jaw clenched so tightly she feared he might shatter a tooth. Vitali sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple, while his son, Marco Jr., glared at Isabella with a mixture of anger and bruised ego. Alessandro, however, remained impassive, a statue carved from granite and ice, his golden eyes fixed on Lorenzo, daring him to challenge her. "Isabella," Lorenzo finally said, his voice dangerously low, "you will go to your room." It was the tone he used when she was a child, the tone that brooked no argument. But she wasn't a child anymore. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "No, father," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I will not. I am not a child to be dismissed. I have made my decision." The defiance in her voice, the steel in her spine, was a direct result of Alessandro's presence. He had awakened something in her, a rebellious spirit she thought long dead. He had reminded her that she had a voice, a will of her own. Lorenzo took a step towards her, his hand raised as if to strike her. It was a gesture he hadn't used in decades, a sign of his desperation and his loss of control. But before his hand could connect, Alessandro moved, with a speed that belied his size, intercepting Lorenzo's arm. "Don't," Alessandro said, his voice a low growl. His grip on Lorenzo's wrist was firm, unbreakable. "Don't even think about it." The two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the tension in the room so thick it was almost palpable. Isabella held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that Alessandro was risking everything, defying her father, challenging the established order. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even her, that she would stand by him, no matter the consequences. Finally, Lorenzo lowered his arm, his face still contorted with anger, but his eyes conceding defeat, at least for now. "This isn't over, Alessandro," he said, his voice shaking. "You have made an enemy tonight." "I've had worse enemies, Lorenzo," Alessandro replied, his voice calm and unwavering. "And I've survived them all." He released Lorenzo's arm and turned to Isabella, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, for her ears only. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was far from all right. Her world had just been turned upside down, and she had no idea what the future held. But in that moment, looking into Alessandro's eyes, she felt a sense of safety, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The gathering quickly dissolved after that, the guests departing with hurried whispers and uneasy glances. Vitali and his son left without a word, their faces dark with anger and resentment. Isabella knew that this was not the end of it, that they would seek revenge, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Lorenzo stormed off to his private study, slamming the door behind him. Isabella was left standing alone with Alessandro, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions.
"Why?"
she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" He looked at her, his golden eyes searching her face. "Because I meant what I said. You were mine, Isabella. You were mine. I never stopped caring." The word caring seemed inadequate to describe the depth of emotion she saw in his eyes, the intensity of his gaze. It was a word that hinted at something far deeper, something that had survived decades of separation and silence. "But it's been 30 years, she said, her voice trembling. "We're different people now." "Some things don't change," he said, his voice low and husky. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a light, tentative touch that sent a shiver through her. "Some bonds are unbreakable." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, the warmth of his hand a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped her all evening. She remembered the feel of his skin against hers, the scent of his cologne a mix of sandalwood, and something uniquely him the way he used to look at her, as if she were the only woman in the world. "It's complicated, Alessandro," she said, opening her eyes, pulling back slightly. "Our family's the consequences, I know," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm not afraid of the consequences." He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle scent of his cologne filling her senses. "I came back for you, Isabella," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I came back to claim what was rightfully mine." His words, his presence, were overwhelming. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. But fear, doubt, the ingrained lessons of a lifetime, held her back. She had built walls around her heart, walls that were now crumbling under the force of his presence. She was drawn by his gravity, but aware of the danger. She was also aware, suddenly, of just how alone she had been. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart flutter. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Not tonight. Just know this, Isabella. I'm not going anywhere. And I won't let anyone hurt you." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "I'll be in touch," he whispered. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She watched as he was swallowed up by the shadows, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if perhaps she'd finally found her way back to something she thought she'd lost forever. Outside, the first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the window panes, a prelude to the storm that was surely coming. Chapter 4. The Weight of Family Secrets. The silence in the house after Alessandro's departure was deafening. Isabella wandered through the empty rooms, the echoes of the evening's confrontation still ringing in her ears. The scent of expensive cigars and lingering perfume, a reminder of the guests who had witnessed her public defiance, clung to the air. She felt adrift, unmoored, like a ship cut loose from its moorings. She found herself in her father's study, the room where the drama had unfolded. The large mahogany desk, usually pristine, was cluttered with papers, a half-empty bottle of scotch sitting beside a heavy crystal tumbler. The remnants of a hastily extinguished cigar smoldered in an ashtray, filling the room with a bitter, acrid smell. She knew her father was wrestling with the fallout of Alessandro's challenge, the potential threat to his power, the unraveling of his carefully laid plans. She picked up a framed photograph from the desk, a picture of her and her father, taken years ago, when she was a young girl. He was smiling in the photograph, his arm around her, his eyes filled with a warmth and affection she rarely saw anymore. She remembered that man, the father who had taught her to ride a horse, who had read her bedtime stories, who had seemed invincible. The years, the weight of his responsibilities, the ruthless world he inhabited, had hardened him, transforming him into the formidable, often intimidating, Don. She traced the outline of his face in the photograph, a wave of sadness washing over her. She missed that man, the father she had lost somewhere along the way. She wondered if Alessandro's return, his challenge to her father's authority, might somehow crack the facade, reveal the man beneath the mask. It was a foolish hope, perhaps, but she clung to it. A sound behind her made her turn. Her father stood in the doorway, his face drawn and haggard, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Regret? Resignation? "Isabella," he said, his voice rough. She put the photograph back on the desk, facing him squarely. "Father." He walked into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He poured himself another drink, his hand shaking slightly. "You humiliated me tonight," he said, his voice low and accusing. "In front of everyone." "I did what I had to do," she replied, her voice firm. "I will not be forced into a marriage I don't want." He took a long swallow of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass. "You don't understand the consequences of your actions," he said. "You have put our family in danger." "Alessandro said he would protect me," she said, the words sounding bolder than she felt. Lorenzo scoffed.
"Alessandro Bianchi?"
"He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's only looking out for himself. He was telling the truth, father, about the promise you made." It was something she had pushed from her mind, thinking it had just been a child's idea. He turned away from her, his shoulders slumping. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice weary. "Things were different then." "What happened?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why did you send him away?" He hesitated, then sighed, the weight of years pressing down on him. He walked over to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. "It's a long story," he said. "A story filled with secrets and betrayals." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen in years. "Your mother, she loved Alessandro," he said, the words heavy with unspoken pain. "She loved him more than she ever loved me." Isabella was stunned. She had always believed her parents had a respectful, if not passionate, marriage. She had never suspected that her mother, a quiet, elegant woman who had always seemed to accept her role, had harbored a secret love for another man. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lorenzo took another drink, his hand still shaking.
It was before you were born, he said.
Alessandro's father, Antonio, was my best friend, my most trusted advisor. We were like brothers. But Antonio, he was ambitious. He wanted more power. And he used your mother to get it. Isabella listened, her heart pounding in her chest, as her father recounted a story of betrayal and heartbreak, a story that had shaped their family's history. Antonio had seduced her mother, promising her a life of love and happiness, a life away from the constraints of the famiglia. He had used her to gain access to her father's secrets, to undermine his authority. I found out, Lorenzo said, his voice filled with a raw, bitter pain. I confronted Antonio. We fought.
He died.
Isabella gasped. She had never known the details of Antonio Bianchi's death. It had always been shrouded in secrecy, a taboo subject within the family. And Alessandro?
She asked.
What did he know?
He was just a boy, Lorenzo said.
He knew nothing of his father's treachery. But I couldn't bear to have him around. A constant reminder of your mother's betrayal, of Antonio's betrayal. He looked at Isabella, his eyes pleading for understanding. I sent him away, to Italy to protect him, to protect myself. I promised your mother, on her deathbed, that I would take care of him, that I would make sure he rose through the ranks. But I couldn't have him near you. I couldn't risk history repeating itself. Isabella felt a wave of conflicting emotions: shock, disbelief, pity, and a grudging understanding. Her father's actions, his cruelty, had been motivated by love, by pain, by a desperate attempt to protect his family, to protect his heart. But it all came crashing down. The lies, the secrets. She felt a sense of connection with the mother she barely knew, a woman who had been trapped, just like she. So, you lied to me, she said, her voice trembling. You let me believe that Alessandro had abandoned me. Lorenzo nodded, his face etched with guilt. I did what I thought was best, he said. I wanted to protect you. Protect me? Isabella's voice rose in anger. You ruined my life. You forced me into a loveless marriage. You denied me the chance to be with the man I loved. And now you want to do it again. With Marco Vitali? Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I'm an old man, Isabella, he said.
I'm tired.
I just want to ensure the future of our family, to secure your safety. My safety? Isabella laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think marrying me off to a monster will keep me safe? Alessandro is right. You're sacrificing me for your own ambitions. That's not true, Lorenzo said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isabella shook her head.
I don't believe you, she said.
I don't know if I can ever forgive you. She turned and walked away, leaving her father standing alone in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him.
She needed air, she needed to think.
The storm outside had intensified, mirroring the turmoil within her. She had to decide what to do next. Could the story be true? And even so, did Alessandro know? Chapter 5.
En welcome alliance.
Isabella stepped out into the storm, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the rain plastering her clothes to her skin. She didn't care. The turmoil inside her was far greater than the tempest raging outside. She walked towards the gardens, the familiar paths now slick and treacherous underfoot. The roses, her mother's pride and joy, were battered and drooping, their petals scattered on the ground like fallen tears. She found herself at the small stone bench where she and Alessandro had shared their first kiss, decades ago. It was hidden beneath a canopy of ancient oak trees, a secluded spot where they had stolen moments of intimacy, away from the prying eyes of their families. She sat down, the cold stones seeping through her wet clothes, chilling her to the bone. She closed her eyes, remembering the feel of Alessandro's lips on hers, the tentative touch of his hand on her cheek, the whispered promises of a future that had never materialized. He had been so young, so full of life, so different from the hardened man who had reappeared in her life. She wondered if that boy still existed, buried beneath the layers of experience, the ruthlessness he had undoubtedly acquired in the intervening years. A rustle of leaves made her open her eyes. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but there he was, Alessandro, standing a few feet away, his silhouette outlined against the stormy sky. He was wearing a dark raincoat, the hood pulled up, obscuring his face. He looked like a figure from a Gothic novel, a dark angel, a harbinger of both danger and salvation. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the wind and rain. She didn't reply, her heart pounding in her chest. She was both drawn to him and terrified of him. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, a familiar comfort in the midst of the storm. "Your father told you," he said, not a question but a statement. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Everything?" he asked. She nodded again. "About my mother, about your father." He was silent for a moment, the only sound the wind and rain. "He told you the truth," he said finally. "Or at least his version of it." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his golden eyes, now visible beneath the hood of his raincoat, searching her face. "My father was not the man your father described," he said, his voice low and intense. "He was ambitious, yes, but he was not a traitor. He loved your mother, and she loved him. But he wouldn't betray Lorenzo. He wouldn't betray his friend." Isabella felt a flicker of hope, a spark of belief in his words. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. "But your father, he died. He was murdered," Alessandro said, his voice hardening. "Murdered by your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." "My father, he would," Alessandro said, his voice filled with a cold, bitter anger. "He was consumed by jealousy, by rage. He couldn't bear the thought of your mother loving another man. So he killed him. And he made it look like an accident." Isabella felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had always suspected that her father was capable of ruthlessness, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I found out years later," Alessandro said. "After I'd established myself in Italy. I had access to information, to people who knew the truth. I pieced it together, bit by bit." "And you came back for revenge?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his expression softening. "I came back for you," he said. "Revenge, that's a secondary consideration." His words, his gaze, were intoxicating. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the pull she felt towards him. But doubt, fear, the ingrained lessons of a lifetime, held her back. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Two figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by the rain. It was Marco Vitali Jr. and one of his men, a hulking brute with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes. Well, Marco Jr. said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do we have here? A lover's tryst in the rain?" Alessandro stood up, his body shielding Isabella's. "Leave us alone, Vitali," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Marco Jr. laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "I don't think so, Bianchi," he said. "You've interfered in my affairs for the last time. You've embarrassed my family. And you've stolen what was rightfully mine." He nodded to his man, who pulled out a gun, the metallic click loud in the stormy night. Isabella gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. This was it. This was the consequence of her defiance, of Alessandro's challenge. "Run, Isabella," Alessandro shouted, pushing her behind him. She hesitated, unwilling to leave him to face Vitali alone. But he gave her another shove, his eyes fierce and determined. "Go." She turned and ran, stumbling through the wet grass, the sound of Marco Jr.'s laughter echoing behind her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away, to find help. The rain was blinding, the wind howling, the night filled with terror. She didn't hear the gunshot, but she felt it, a sharp, searing pain in her shoulder. She stumbled, falling to the ground, the cold, wet earth pressing against her cheek. She lay there, gasping for breath, her vision blurring, the darkness closing in. She had to get up.
Alessandro.
She thought she heard him call her name, distorted by the wind and rain. But she couldn't be sure. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Empty Villa. Isabella woke to the smell of antiseptic and the muffled sound of voices. She was lying in a bed, her shoulder bandaged, her body aching. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. She blinked, trying to focus her eyes, to make sense of her surroundings. She was in a room she didn't recognize, a small, sparsely furnished room with white walls and a single window overlooking a courtyard. A woman entered the room, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was dressed in a simple nurse's uniform. "You're awake," the woman said, her voice soft and soothing. "How are you feeling?" "Where am I?" Isabella asked, her voice hoarse. "You're safe," the woman said. "You're at Alessandro's villa. He brought you here after the incident."
Alessandro.
The memory of the storm, of Marco Vitali Jr., of the gunshot, flooded back. She felt a surge of fear, of relief, of confusion. "Alessandro, is he all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman hesitated, her smile fading slightly.
He's alive," she said.
"He was injured, but he's stable. He's been asking for you." Injured. The word sent a chill through Isabella. She had to see him, to know that he was truly all right. "Can I see him?" she asked. The woman nodded. "I'll let him know you're awake," she said. "He'll be here soon." The woman left the room, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the events of the previous night. She remembered running, the gunshot, the pain, the darkness. She remembered Alessandro's voice, calling her name. She had been so close to death, so close to losing everything. And Alessandro, he had saved her, risked his life for her.
Why?
Was it love, revenge, or something else entirely? She didn't know, but she knew she had to find out. The door opened, and Alessandro walked in. He was pale, his arm in a sling, but his golden eyes were as bright and intense as ever. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, a slight limp betraying his injuries. "Isabella," he said, his voice husky with emotion. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his gaze searching her face. "How are you feeling?" "I'm all right," she said, her voice trembling. "But you were hurt." He nodded, his expression grim. "Vitali's men got me in the arm," he said. "But it's nothing serious. I've had worse." She reached out, her hand touching his good arm, her fingers tracing the outline of his muscles beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved my life." He covered her hand with his grip warm and strong. "I told you I would protect you," he said. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside the room ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, connected by a bond that had survived decades of separation, a bond that was now stronger than ever. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. After I fell," he hesitated, his expression darkening. "Vitali and his man, they ran off," he said. "I managed to get to you. I carried you back to the house. My men, they took care of everything." She knew what taking care of everything meant in their world. It meant violence, retribution, a settling of scores. She shuddered, the reality of their situation sinking in. "My father," she said, her voice trembling. "What will he do?" Alessandro sighed, his expression grim.
"He'll be furious," he said. "He'll blame me."
"He'll probably try to retaliate. We're at war, aren't we?" she said, the words a statement, not a question. He nodded.
"It seems so," he said.
"But I won't let him hurt you, Isabella. I promise you that." He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. His men would be loyal, he knew. He had built his famiglia from the ground up, selecting only the most loyal. Unlike her father, who relied on old alliances and fear, Alessandro led with a quiet strength. He believed in earning the respect of his men, not demanding it. And they would never give up on her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, seeking comfort in his presence, in the warmth of his body. She felt exhausted, drained, both physically and emotionally. But she also felt a sense of peace, a sense of being safe, of being where she belonged. Even if this safety came with a price. "I'm tired, Alessandro," she said, her eyes heavy. He stroked her hair, his touch gentle and soothing. "Rest now," he said. "You're safe here. I won't leave your side." She closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep, the sound of his heartbeat a steady rhythm in her ear. She knew that the future was uncertain, that the storm was far from over. But in that moment, in Alessandro's arms, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to weather the storm together. She dreamed of her mother, of a love that had defied the odds. She wondered if she could be so brave. She woke several hours later, the room dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window. Alessandro was still there, sitting beside her, watching over her. He hadn't moved, hadn't left her side. He looked so calm, so in control. But she knew that beneath the surface, he was as troubled as she was, as uncertain about the future. She wondered if he was thinking of all the blood that had been shed. She reached over and took his hand. He squeezed hers, and they sat in silence. The house was silent. It was eerie to hear the echo of her footsteps. It was nothing like her father's place, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. She wondered if this was what it was always like. Chapter 7. The Price of Protection. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, tense meetings, and the constant presence of Alessandro's men, silent shadows who moved through the villa like ghosts, their eyes ever watchful, their hands never far from the weapons they carried. Isabella was confined to the villa for her own safety, Alessandro insisted. She was a prisoner, albeit a pampered one, surrounded by luxury, but with her freedom curtailed. She spent her days wandering through the vast, echoing rooms, exploring the library filled with leather-bound books, admiring the art collection that adorned the walls, and gazing out at the manicured gardens, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed landscape of her emotions. She felt like a caged bird, longing to fly, to escape the gilded cage that had become her reality. Alessandro was a constant presence, dividing his time between attending to the business of the famiglia and tending to her. He was attentive, solicitous, his golden eyes filled with a concern that both warmed and unsettled her. He treated her with a tenderness, a reverence, that she hadn't experienced in years, not even with her late husband, Marco. He brought her breakfast in bed, read to her from her favorite books, and sat with her in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, avoiding the elephant in the room, the war that was brewing between their families, the price of his protection. She knew that he was keeping things from her, shielding her from the brutal realities of their world. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way he flinched whenever the phone rang, the hushed conversations he had with his lieutenants, Rico and Giancarlo, two men whose loyalty to Alessandro was absolute, their faces hardened by years of violence. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn, she decided to confront him. "What's happening, Alessandro?" she asked, her voice low. "Tell me the truth." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. "There have been skirmishes," he said. "Minor incidents. Vitali is testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses." "And my father?" she asked. He hesitated. "He's consolidating his forces," he said. "He's calling in favors, forging alliances. He's preparing for war." Isabella felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the grim reality in Alessandro's voice, made it all the more terrifying. "What will happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sadness. "I don't know," he said. "But I won't let him hurt you, Isabella. I'll protect you, no matter the cost." The cost. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She knew that the cost of his protection would be high, that it would involve bloodshed, violence, perhaps even death. I don't want anyone to die, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not for me. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip warm and reassuring.
I know, he said.
But this is our world, Isabella. This is the way things are. There's no escaping it. There has to be another way, she said, her voice pleading. A way to end this, without more bloodshed. He shook his head.
I don't see it, he said.
Your father, he won't back down. He's too proud, too stubborn. And Vitaly, he's a snake, waiting to strike. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. And what about you, Alessandro? She asked. What do you want? He hesitated, his gaze unwavering. I want you, he said, his voice low and husky. I want you safe. I want a life with you. A life away from all this. His words, his tone, sent a shiver through her. She believed him. She trusted him, but she also knew that his desires, his dreams, were at odds with the reality of their situation. It's a fantasy, Alessandro, she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. We can't escape our families, our past. It's always going to be there, hanging over us. Maybe, he said, his voice stubborn. But I'm not giving up. I'm not going to let them win. I'm going to fight for us, Isabella. For a future together. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a kiss filled with longing, with desperation, with a fragile hope that defied the odds. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She kissed him back, with a fierce intensity, pouring all her fear, her doubt, her love, into the kiss. It was a kiss that acknowledged the darkness that surrounded them, but also celebrated the light that still flickered between them. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. I had a thought, she said, after a long moment. What is it? He asked. What if we offered my father something? A trade, perhaps.
Alessandro frowned.
He looked doubtful, but he was listening.
Like what? I don't know yet.
She admitted. But there must be something. Some business deal. Something to make him stop. Alessandro looked at her, then out at the gardens. He was silent for a moment, deep in thought. He had that calculating glint in his eye. She knew he was considering all the possibilities, weighing the risks and rewards. The price of everything. He looked back at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Perhaps, he said, perhaps there is. I think I know the price my famiglia could pay. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. The idea, once spoken, took root and grew, nurtured by a desperate hope and fueled by Alessandro's strategic mind. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents, making calls, consulting with Rico and Giancarlo, his trusted lieutenants. Isabella was excluded from these meetings, left to pace the confines of the villa, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She knew that Alessandro was crafting a plan, a dangerous gamble that could either save them or destroy them. He finally emerged from his study, his face drawn but his eyes alight with a determined spark. He found her in the library, surrounded by books, seeking solace in the familiar scent of old paper and leather. I have a plan, he said, his voice low and urgent. But it's risky. And it requires your cooperation. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest.
Tell me, she said.
He sat down beside her, outlining his strategy, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the silence of the room. It was a complex plan, involving a delicate dance of deception, a web of alliances and betrayals, a gamble that relied on her father's greed and Vitaly's ambition. The core of the plan revolved around a lucrative shipping contract, a deal that controlled the flow of goods into New York Harbor, a prize that both Lorenzo and Vitaly coveted. Alessandro proposed to offer the contract to Lorenzo as a peace offering, a way to end the conflict. But the offer would be a feint, a carefully crafted illusion designed to expose Vitaly's treachery and drive a wedge between him and Lorenzo. It's a trap, Isabella said, her voice trembling. You're using the contract as bait.
Alessandro nodded.
Vitaly wants that contract more than anything, he said. He'll betray your father to get it. And when he does, We'll be there to expose him. But what if it doesn't work?
She asked.
What if my father sees through your plan? Alessandro's expression hardened. Then we fight, he said. But I believe it will work. Your father is blinded by his hatred for me, by his desire for revenge. He won't see it coming. The plan required Isabella to play a crucial role. She had to convince her father that she was genuinely afraid of Alessandro, that she wanted to return home, that she was willing to cooperate with him to end the conflict. It was a deception that went against everything she felt, a betrayal of the trust she had tentatively placed in Alessandro. I don't know if I can do it, she said, her voice filled with doubt. I'm not an actress, Alessandro. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip warm and reassuring. You can do it, Isabella, he said. You're stronger than you think. And I'll be there to guide you, to protect you. He explained her role in detail, coaching her on what to say, how to act, how to play on her father's emotions, his desire to protect her, his belief in her loyalty. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of deception, and the stakes were incredibly high. The next day, Alessandro arranged a meeting with Lorenzo, a neutral location, a small, unassuming trattoria in Little Italy, a place where they had met many times before, in a different life, a different time. Isabella was nervous, her stomach churning with anxiety, her hands trembling as she dressed for the meeting. Alessandro accompanied her, his presence a source of both comfort and fear. He was calm, composed, his golden eyes radiating a confidence that she desperately wished she felt. He held her hand as they walked into the trattoria, his grip tight and reassuring. Lorenzo was already there, sitting at a corner table, flanked by two of his men, their faces grim and watchful. He looked older, more haggard than she remembered, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and suspicion. Isabella, he said, his voice rough. He stood up, his gaze flickering between her and Alessandro. You look well. I'm terrified, father, she said, her voice trembling, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I want to come home. It was a lie, a carefully rehearsed line, but it felt like a betrayal, a violation of the trust she had placed in Alessandro. She saw the flicker of doubt in her father's eyes, the momentary hesitation. Alessandro has been holding me against my will, she continued, her voice gaining strength, her performance becoming more convincing. He's dangerous, father. He's planning something. Lorenzo's gaze narrowed. What is he planning? He asked. Isabella glanced at Alessandro, a flicker of fear, of desperation in her eyes. It was a performance, but it felt all too real. He's offered me a deal, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A way to end this conflict. He wants to give you the shipping contract. Lorenzo's eyes widened, a flicker of greed, of ambition, in their depths. The bait had been taken. The shipping contract? He said, his voice incredulous. Why would he do that? He says he wants peace, Isabella said, her voice trembling. He says he's tired of fighting. But I don't trust him, father. I think it's a trap. Alessandro remained silent, his expression impassive, letting Isabella play her role. He knew that Lorenzo was suspicious, that he was weighing the risks and rewards, the potential for gain against the possibility of deception. I need your help, father, Isabella said, her voice pleading. I want to come home. I want to be safe. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He saw the fear, the desperation, the vulnerability. He saw his daughter, the child he had always sworn to protect. I'll get you out of this, Isabella, he said, his voice firm. I promise you. I won't let him hurt you. The trap had been sprung. Now, all they had to do was wait for Vitali to make his move, to betray Lorenzo and walk into Alessandro's carefully laid plan. As they left, she stole a glance at Alessandro. He offered a small, confident smile.
Chapter 9.
Beneath the surface of loyalty. The following days were a tense waiting game. Isabella remained at Alessandro's villa, playing the role of the fearful captive, while Alessandro and his men monitored Lorenzo and Vitali's movements, waiting for the inevitable betrayal. Isabella found herself increasingly drawn to Alessandro's world, fascinated by the intricate web of loyalty and deceit that defined the Mafia. She spent hours talking to Rico and Giancarlo, Alessandro's lieutenants, learning about their lives, their motivations, their unwavering devotion to Alessandro. Rico, the older of the two, was a quiet, introspective man with a weathered face and sad, knowing eyes. He had been with Alessandro since the beginning, a loyal friend and confidant, a man who had seen it all, done it all. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. Giancarlo, on the other hand, was younger, more impulsive, with a fiery temper and a quick wit. He was Alessandro's muscle, his enforcer, a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. But beneath the rough exterior, Isabella sensed a deep-seated loyalty, a fierce protectiveness towards Alessandro. She learned that Alessandro had built his famiglia on a foundation of respect and loyalty, not fear and intimidation, like her father. He had hand-picked his men, choosing them for their skills, their trustworthiness, their devotion. He treated them as equals, not as subordinates, and they, in turn, would follow him to hell and back. One afternoon, while Alessandro was out attending to business, Isabella found herself in the library with Rico. He was cleaning his guns, a ritual he performed with meticulous care, his movements precise and deliberate. "You've been with Alessandro for a long time," she said, breaking the silence. Rico nodded, his eyes focused on his task. "Since we were boys," he said. "We grew up together in the same neighborhood in Italy. We went through hell together."
"He trusts you implicitly," she said.
Rico looked up, his expression softening slightly. "And I trust him," he said. "He's a good man, Isabella. A rare thing in our world." "He's different from my father," she said.
Rico nodded.
"Lorenzo is old school," he said. "He rules through fear, through intimidation. Alessandro, he leads by example. He inspires loyalty. But he's still a mafioso," she said, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "He's still involved in violence, in crime." Rico sighed, putting down his gun. "It's the life we were born into, Isabella," he said. "There's no escaping it. But Alessandro, he tries to do things differently. He tries to minimize the bloodshed, to protect the innocent." "He's protecting me," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Rico looked at her, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "He cares about you, Isabella," he said. "More than you know. He's been waiting for you for a long time." His words, his tone, confirmed what she already suspected. Alessandro's feelings for her ran deep, deeper than she had dared to hope. But she also knew that their love was a dangerous thing, a fragile flame in a world of darkness. Later that evening, Giancarlo came to find her, his face unusually grim.
"Alessandro wants to see you," he said.
In the study, Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She knew instinctively that something had happened. She followed Giancarlo to the study, her anxiety growing with each step. Alessandro was pacing the room, his expression tense, his golden eyes blazing with anger. Rico was standing by the window, his face grim. "What is it?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Alessandro stopped pacing, turning to her. "Vitali made his move," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He contacted Lorenzo, offering him a deal. He's willing to betray us, to give Lorenzo the shipping contract, in exchange for you." Isabella felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the blatant disregard for her life, her feelings, made her sick to her stomach. "He wants to trade me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Like I'm some commodity." Alessandro's jaw clenched. "He won't get you, Isabella," he said, his voice fierce. "I swear it." "What happens now?" she asked. Alessandro exchanged a look with Rico. "We move," he said. "We expose Vitali's treachery. We show Lorenzo that he's been betrayed. And then we take them both down." The plan was set in motion. Alessandro arranged another meeting with Lorenzo, this time at a warehouse on the docks, a place where the shipping contract was supposedly being finalized. Isabella was not present at this meeting. Alessandro deemed it too dangerous. She remained at the villa, surrounded by Alessandro's men, her anxiety reaching fever pitch. Hours passed, an eternity of waiting, of wondering, of fearing the worst. Finally, Alessandro returned, his face grim, his clothes stained with something dark.
She didn't want to ask.
It's done, he said, his voice hoarse.
Vitali is dead.
Lorenzo, he's been neutralized. Neutralized? She asked, her voice trembling.
Alessandro hesitated. He's alive, he said.
But he's no longer a threat. He's lost everything. His power, his influence, his famiglia. Isabella felt a wave of relief, followed by a surge of guilt. She had played a part in her father's downfall, in the destruction of his life. Even though he had treated her cruelly, even though he had tried to force her into a marriage she didn't want, he was still her father. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Alessandro walked towards her, taking her hands in his. His grip was warm, reassuring, but his hands were still stained with the evidence of the night's violence. It's over, Isabella, he said. It's finally over. We're free.
Free.
The word echoed in her mind, a promise of a new life, a life away from the darkness, the violence, the constant fear. But she knew that freedom came at a price that had been paid in blood. She wondered if she would ever truly be free, if the ghosts of the past would ever stop haunting her. She looked up at Alessandro, a question in her eyes. His face was difficult to read, but she knew one thing was true.
She was his now. Completely.
And for the first time, she did not feel fear, but a nervous anticipation of what that might mean. Chapter 10. The storm breaks. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation was a whirlwind of activity. Alessandro's men worked swiftly and efficiently, cleaning up the mess, disposing of evidence, ensuring that the authorities would find nothing to link them to Vitali's death or Lorenzo's downfall. Isabella remained secluded in the villa, shielded from the grim realities of the situation, but she couldn't escape the knowledge that lives had been shattered, that the balance of power in the city had shifted dramatically. Alessandro was a changed man. The tension that had gripped him for weeks seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense of accomplishment. But there was also a weariness in his eyes, a shadow that hinted at the toll the violence had taken on him. He spent hours on the phone, making calls, issuing orders, consolidating his power, ensuring that the vacuum created by Lorenzo's demise was filled swiftly and decisively. He was becoming the undisputed Don, the most powerful man in the city, and Isabella was both awed and frightened by the transformation. She tried to talk to him about it, to express her concerns, her guilt, her lingering doubts about their future. But he brushed her aside, assuring her that everything was under control, that she was safe, that they could finally be together, without fear. It's over, Isabella, he said repeatedly, his voice firm, his golden eyes unwavering. We've won. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the storm was far from finished. She felt a growing unease, a sense of impending doom that she couldn't explain. She had nightmares, vivid dreams filled with images of violence, of betrayal, of loss. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her body trembling. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she decided to voice her fears. I'm worried, Alessandro, she said, her voice low. I don't feel safe. I feel like something bad is going to happen. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. You're just tired, Isabella, he said. You've been through a lot. You need to rest. It's more than that, she insisted. I feel it in my gut. Something's not right. He looked at her, his golden eyes searching her face. What do you mean? He asked. I don't know, she said. But I feel like we're being watched. Like someone's waiting for us to make a mistake. He dismissed her concerns, attributing them to her anxiety, her trauma. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, that they were in danger. Her fears were confirmed a few days later, when a bomb exploded in one of Alessandro's warehouses, a clear message from a rival family, a challenge to his authority. It was a minor incident, causing minimal damage, but it was a sign that the peace was fragile, that the war was not over. Alessandro responded swiftly and brutally, retaliating against the family he suspected of being responsible, unleashing a wave of violence that rocked the city. Isabella was horrified, disgusted by the bloodshed, the senseless loss of life. She pleaded with him to stop, to find another way, but he was deaf to her pleas. "This is the only way, Isabella," he said, his voice cold and hard. "This is the only language they understand." The city was plunged into chaos, a state of undeclared war, with rival families vying for power, settling old scores, seeking revenge. Isabella felt like she was drowning in a sea of violence, a world of darkness she couldn't escape. She tried to distance herself from it, spending her days in the library, reading, trying to lose herself in the stories of others, to forget the grim reality of her own life. But it was impossible to ignore the constant presence of Alessandro's men, the hushed conversations, the tense atmosphere that permeated the villa. One afternoon, while she was browsing the shelves, she stumbled upon a hidden room, a small, secret chamber behind a bookcase. Curiosity overcoming her caution, she pushed the bookcase aside, revealing a narrow doorway. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dimly lit, filled with dusty furniture and old boxes. It smelled of mothballs and decay, a forgotten space, a repository of secrets. She began to explore, her fingers tracing the outlines of the objects, her eyes scanning the shelves. She found old photographs, letters, documents, relics of Alessandro's past, a past she knew little about. She discovered a box filled with letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. She recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. It was her mother's. The letters were addressed to Antonio Bianchi, Alessandro's father. With trembling hands, she opened one of the letters, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to read, her eyes scanning the faded ink, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was discovering. The letters were love letters, passionate declarations of love, a testament to the forbidden relationship between her mother and Antonio Bianchi. But they were more than that. They revealed a conspiracy, a plot to overthrow Lorenzo, to take control of the famiglia. Isabella's father's story had been a lie. Her mother had been involved in a plot with Antonio, but not in the way Lorenzo had described. They had been planning to expose Lorenzo's crimes, his corruption, his brutality. They had wanted to reform the famiglia, to create a better world. And Lorenzo had found out. He had killed Antonio, not in a fit of jealous rage, but in a cold, calculated act of self-preservation. He had silenced them, destroyed their dreams, and buried the truth. Isabella felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been living a lie her entire life. Her father, the man she had both feared and respected, was a murderer, a tyrant, a man who had destroyed the lives of everyone around him. And Alessandro, did he know? Had he known all along? Had he been using her, manipulating her, to exact his revenge on her father? She was interrupted by a loud thunderclap, followed by rain. She jumped. She closed the letters and returned them to their hiding place. She had to find out the truth. Chapter 11. Scars of the Heart. Isabella left the hidden room, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery. The letters had shattered her world, revealing the truth about her father, her mother, and the tangled web of lies that had shaped her life. She felt betrayed, manipulated, used. And she couldn't shake the fear that Alessandro had known the truth all along, that he had been playing her, using her to exact his revenge. She found him in his study, sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. He looked up as she entered, his golden eyes questioning. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. He frowned, sensing the urgency in her tone. "What is it?" he asked. She walked towards him, her hands clenched into fists. "I found something," she said. "In the hidden room." His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Apprehension? Guilt? "What did you find?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled. "Letters," she said. "Letters from my mother to your father." He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. "They were lovers," she said, her voice rising. But it wasn't like my father said. They weren't trying to betray him. They were trying to expose him. His crimes, his corruption. Alessandro sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. I know, he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Isabella felt a wave of anger, of betrayal, wash over her.
You knew?
She said, her voice incredulous. You knew all along? And you didn't tell me? He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I found out years ago, he said. After I came to Italy, I did my own investigation. I discovered the truth. And you used me, she said, her voice trembling. You manipulated me to get your revenge on my father. He shook his head. No, Isabella, he said. That's not true. I came back for you. Because I loved you. I still love you. Love?
She scoffed.
You call this love? Lying to me, using me, putting me in danger? I did what I had to do, he said, his voice hardening. To protect you, to avenge my father, to end the cycle of violence. You could have told me, she said, her voice breaking. You could have trusted me. He stood up, walking towards her, his presence dominating the room. I couldn't risk it, he said. I didn't know if I could trust you. You were Lorenzo's daughter. You were loyal to him. I was, she said. But I'm not anymore. Not after what I've learned. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Did you ever love me, Alessandro? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Or was it all a lie? He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a light, tentative touch that sent a shiver through her. I loved you, he said, his voice low and husky. I loved you then, and I love you now. More than anything. His words, his touch, were intoxicating. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the pull she felt towards him. But the doubt, the fear, the betrayal, were still there, a gaping wound in her heart. I don't know if I can believe you, she said, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle scent of his cologne filling her senses. I know I've hurt you, Isabella, he said, his voice a low murmur. I know I've made mistakes. But I swear to you, my feelings for you are real. They've always been real. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a kiss filled with longing, with regret, with a desperate plea for forgiveness. She hesitated, her mind warring with her heart. She wanted to push him away, to reject him, to punish him for his lies, his deception. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, magnetized by his presence, his touch, his words. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She kissed him back, with a fierce intensity, pouring all her confusion, her anger, her love, into the kiss. It was a kiss that acknowledged the pain, the betrayal, but also clung to the hope, the possibility of a future together. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. I don't know if I can forgive you, Alessandro, she said after a long moment. I know, he said, but I hope in time, I can show you. I can be a better man. I am not my father. Or yours. Isabella pulled away, turning from his intense gaze. She walked to the window. I need time, she said, her voice low. Time to think, to process everything. I understand, he said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. She turned back to look at him. He looked sincere. But could he really change? Could she? Could they escape the shadows of their pasts, the legacy of violence and betrayal that had shaped their lives? She didn't know, but she knew she needed to find out. She needed to decide if she could forgive him, if she could trust him, if she could build a future with him, a future free from the darkness of their past. The scars of the heart, she realized, were the deepest, the most difficult to heal. But they were not impossible to overcome. It would take time, trust, and a willingness to let go of the pain that had haunted both of them. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope. The The following weeks were a period of quiet introspection, a time of healing and reflection for Isabella. She spent hours walking in the gardens, reading in the library, and exploring the villa, trying to come to terms with the revelations about her family, her past, and her complicated relationship with Alessandro. She kept her distance from him, avoiding his touch, his gaze, his attempts to bridge the gap that had formed between them. She needed space, time to process her emotions, to decide if she could forgive him, if she could trust him, if she could build a future with him. Alessandro respected her distance, giving her the space she needed, but he was always there, a constant presence in the villa, a silent reminder of his love, his regret, his determination to win her back. He left small gifts for her, a bouquet of her favorite flowers, a rare edition of a book she had mentioned wanting to read, a handwritten note expressing his feelings. These gestures, small but significant, touched her, chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. She found herself drawn to the hidden room, the place where she had discovered the letters that had shattered her world. She reread the letters, again and again, trying to understand her mother, her motivations, her forbidden love for Antonio Bianchi. She began to see her mother not as a weak, passive woman, but as a courageous, rebellious spirit, a woman who had dared to defy the constraints of her world, to fight for love, for a better future. She also found herself thinking about her father, not with hatred or anger, but with a mixture of pity and understanding. He had been a product of his environment, a man trapped by the traditions, the expectations, the violence of the Mafia. He had made terrible choices, committed unspeakable acts, but he had also loved her, in his own twisted way. One afternoon, while she was sitting in the gardens, Alessandro approached her. He didn't speak, just sat down beside her on the bench, respecting her silence. They sat there for a long time, watching the butterflies flit among the flowers, listening to the birdsong, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low, "about my mother, about your father, about us." Alessandro turned to her, his golden eyes questioning. "I understand," she said. "Why you did what you did. Why you kept the truth from me." He nodded, his expression relieved. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of the truth." "I was angry," she said. "Hurt. Betrayed. But I'm not anymore. Not entirely." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand, a light, tentative touch. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the regret, the love. She saw the man he was, the man he could be. "I'm trying," she said. "It's not easy, but I'm trying." He smiled, a slow, hesitant smile that made her heart flutter. "That's all I ask," he said. They sat there for a while longer, talking, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their hopes for the future. It was a slow, tentative process, a rebuilding of trust, a healing of wounds. "I want to do something," Isabella said, after a long silence. "Something to honor my mother's memory, to make amends for my father's sins." Alessandro looked at her, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "I want to use my inheritance," she said, "to help people, to create something good, something that will counteract the darkness of our past." Alessandro nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good idea," he said. "A way to redeem our families, to build a better future." They began to discuss possibilities, brainstorming ideas, making plans. They decided to establish a foundation, a charitable organization that would provide support for victims of violence, for families affected by crime, for communities ravaged by poverty and despair. It would be a legacy of hope, a testament to their commitment to change, to build a better world. They decided to name the foundation after their mothers, Elena Moretti and Sofia Bianchi, two women who had dared to dream of a different life, a life free from violence and oppression. It was a way to honor their memory, to redeem their sacrifices, to build a future worthy of their love. As they talked, Isabella felt a sense of purpose, a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She saw a future, a path forward, a way to escape the shadows of the past. She saw a life with Alessandro, a life built on love, trust, and a shared commitment to making a difference. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, setbacks. But she knew that together, they could overcome anything. She looked at Alessandro, her heart filled with a tentative, fragile hope. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, her grip firm. "We can do this," she said, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. Together, he squeezed her hand, his golden eyes shining with love and determination. "Together," he repeated. The glimmer of hope had solidified into a tangible, real possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt like she could breathe again. She could see a future, not just for herself, but for their families, for their city. A future where the darkness of the past could be replaced by the light of a new beginning. Chapter 13. The Unraveling Truth. The establishment of the Elena and Sofia Foundation marked a turning point in Isabella and Alessandro's lives. It was a tangible symbol of their commitment to change, to building a better future, to moving beyond the violence and betrayal of their past. They threw themselves into the work, pouring their energy, their resources, their passion into creating an organization that would make a real difference in the lives of others. They hired a team of dedicated professionals, social workers, lawyers, educators, people who shared their vision, their commitment to helping those in need. They secured funding, established partnerships with community organizations, and launched programs to provide support for victims of domestic violence, for children affected by crime, for families struggling with poverty. The work was demanding, challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. Isabella found a sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. She discovered a strength, a resilience she didn't know she possessed. She was no longer just the Don's daughter, the Mafia wife, the sheltered widow. She was a woman of action, a force for change, a leader in her own right. Alessandro, too, was transformed by the work. He saw the positive impact they were having on the community, the lives they were changing, the hope they were inspiring. He began to distance himself from the business of the famiglia, delegating more responsibility to Rico and Giancarlo, focusing his energy on the foundation. He was becoming a different man, a man driven not by power and greed, but by compassion and a genuine desire to make amends for the sins of the past. But the past, as they soon discovered, was not so easily escaped. The shadows of their families, the legacy of violence and betrayal, continued to haunt them. There were those within the famiglia who resented Alessandro's shift in focus, who saw the foundation as a weakness, a betrayal of their traditions. There were whispers of discontent, rumors of rebellion, threats of violence. One evening, as Isabella and Alessandro were returning home from a fundraising gala for the foundation, they were ambushed. A car pulled up beside them, and a hail of bullets shattered the windows, piercing the metal, spraying glass and debris. Alessandro reacted instantly, shoving Isabella to the floor, shielding her with his body. He returned fire, his aim precise and deadly, hitting the driver of the attacking car. The car swerved, crashing into a lamppost, the occupants spilling out onto the street. A firefight ensued, a brief but brutal exchange of gunfire. Alessandro's men, who had been following them in a separate car, arrived on the scene, joining the fray. The attackers were quickly subdued, killed or captured. Isabella was shaken, terrified, but unharmed. Alessandro had protected her, once again, risking his life to save hers. But the attack was a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, the enemies they had made, the fragility of their newfound peace.
Who was it?
Isabella asked, her voice trembling, as they sat in the back of their bullet-riddled car, waiting for the police to arrive. Alessandro's face was grim, his golden eyes blazing with anger.
"I don't know," he said.
"But I'll find out. And they'll pay." The investigation into the attack revealed a conspiracy within Alessandro's own famiglia, a plot to overthrow him, to return to the old ways, to the ruthless pursuit of power and profit. The leader of the conspiracy was none other than Giancarlo, Alessandro's trusted lieutenant, the man he had considered a friend, a brother. Isabella was shocked, devastated by the betrayal. She had trusted Giancarlo, had welcomed him into her life, had seen him as a symbol of Alessandro's transformation, his commitment to a different path.
Why?
She asked Alessandro, her voice filled with disbelief. Why would he do this? Alessandro sighed, his expression weary.
Greed, he said.
Ambition. He saw an opportunity to seize power, to take control of the famiglia. He thought I had gone soft, that I had lost my edge. The betrayal cut Alessandro deeply. He had trusted Giancarlo, had confided in him, had treated him like family. He felt a sense of personal failure, a sense that he had misjudged Giancarlo's character, that he had been blind to his ambition, his resentment. What will you do? Isabella asked, her voice low. Alessandro's expression hardened. I'll do what I have to do, he said. I'll deal with him. And anyone else who stands in my way. Isabella knew what deal with him meant. It meant violence, retribution, a settling of scores. She pleaded with him to find another way, to spare Giancarlo's life, to show mercy. But he was deaf to her pleas. This is the only way, Isabella, he said. This is the only language they understand. I have to protect my famiglia, protect our future. Isabella knew that he was right, that in their world, mercy was often seen as weakness, that violence was the currency of power. But she couldn't help but feel a sense of profound sadness, a sense of loss. The dream of a peaceful future, a life free from violence, seemed to be slipping away, fading into the darkness of their past. The truth was unraveling, revealing a world far more complex, far more brutal, than she had ever imagined. And she was caught in the middle, torn between her love for Alessandro and her desire for a different life, a life free from the shadows of the Mafia. Chapter 14. Trapped between two worlds. The days following Giancarlo's betrayal were tense and fraught with danger. Alessandro moved swiftly and decisively, rooting out the conspirators within his famiglia, consolidating his power, ensuring that no one else dared to challenge his authority. He was ruthless, efficient, showing no mercy to those who had betrayed him. Isabella watched, horrified, as he descended back into the darkness of his past, the world of violence and retribution she had hoped he had left behind. She tried to reason with him, to plead with him to find another way, but he was unyielding. He was convinced that the only way to protect their future, to secure their safety, was to eliminate any threat, to crush any opposition. I'm doing this for us, Isabella, he said, his voice cold and hard. To protect you, to protect our foundation, to ensure that we can have a life together. But Isabella couldn't see a future in his actions, only a continuation of the cycle of violence, a perpetuation of the darkness that had haunted their families for generations. She felt trapped, caught between two worlds, the world of the Mafia, with its brutality and betrayal, and the world of hope and compassion she had glimpsed through the Foundation. She began to distance herself from Alessandro, spending more time at the Foundation, immersing herself in the work, finding solace in the positive impact they were having on the community. She surrounded herself with people who shared her values, her commitment to making a difference, to building a better world. She found herself increasingly drawn to Michael, a lawyer who worked for the Foundation, a kind, compassionate man who shared her vision, her passion for social justice. He was everything Alessandro was not: gentle, empathetic, committed to nonviolence. He listened to her, understood her, supported her without judgment. She confided in him, sharing her fears, her doubts, her disillusionment with Alessandro's actions. He offered her comfort, understanding, and a different perspective on the world. You don't belong in that world, Isabella, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You're a good person, with a kind heart. You deserve better. His words resonated with her, confirming what she had been feeling for a long time. She was trapped, suffocating in the world of the Mafia, a world she had never truly belonged to. She longed for freedom, for peace, for a life free from violence and fear. She began to contemplate leaving Alessandro, leaving the villa, leaving the famiglia behind. It was a terrifying prospect, a dangerous decision, but she couldn't see any other way. She couldn't continue to live in a world of darkness, a world that went against everything she believed in. One evening, as she was packing her belongings, preparing to leave, Alessandro found her. He stood in the doorway of her bedroom, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I'm leaving," she said. "I can't do this anymore, Alessandro." He walked towards her, his golden eyes blazing with anger and hurt.
"You can't leave me," he said.
"I love you. I need you." "I love you too, Alessandro," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't live like this. I can't be a part of this world anymore." He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "You belong with me," he said. "You're mine. I won't let you go." She struggled against his grip, her fear rising. "Let me go, Alessandro," she said.
"You're hurting me."
He released her, his expression softening slightly.
"I'm sorry," he said.
"I don't want to hurt you. But I can't lose you, Isabella. You're everything to me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears.
"I'm not yours, Alessandro," she said.
"I'm my own person. And I need to be free." He stood there, staring at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, desperation. He knew he was losing her, that he couldn't force her to stay, that his grip on her was slipping away. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper.
"I don't know," she said.
"But I'll be safe. I'll find a way." She turned away from him, picking up her suitcase, her heart heavy with sadness and regret. She walked towards the door, leaving him standing there, alone in the silence of her empty room. As she walked out of the villa into the night, she felt a sense of liberation, a sense of relief, but also a profound sense of loss. She was leaving behind the man she loved, the life she had known, the world she had grown up in. She was stepping into the unknown, a future uncertain, but filled with the possibility of hope, of peace, of a life free from the shadows of the Mafia. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She was still trying to decide where to go. Michael had offered his spare bedroom, or she could get a hotel. But one thing was certain. She would not stay in that house another night. She had to trust her instincts. She had to leave. Chapter 15. A desperate plea. Isabella drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had left Alessandro, left the villa, left the world of the Mafia behind, but she didn't know where to go, what to do, how to start a new life. She considered going to Michael, the lawyer from the foundation, but she hesitated. She didn't want to burden him, to involve him in her dangerous situation. She also wasn't sure about her feelings for him. He was kind, compassionate, a good man, but she didn't know if she was ready for another relationship, if she could ever truly love anyone the way she had loved Alessandro. She knew her safety was most important. She thought about going to the police, seeking protection, but she dismissed the idea. She didn't trust them. She knew that the Mafia had infiltrated every level of law enforcement, that they could reach her anywhere. She ended up at a small, anonymous motel on the outskirts of the city, a place where she could hide, gather her thoughts, make a plan. She checked in under a false name, paid in cash, and locked herself in her room, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. She spent the night tossing and turning, unable to sleep, haunted by images of Alessandro, his face a mixture of anger and hurt, his golden eyes blazing with a desperate plea. She knew that he wouldn't let her go easily, that he would come after her, that he would use all his power and influence to find her. The next morning, she called Michael, her voice trembling. "I need your help," she said. "I've left Alessandro." Michael was shocked, concerned, but also relieved. He had sensed her growing unhappiness, her disillusionment with Alessandro's world. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Are you safe?" She told him about the motel, the false name, her fear of Alessandro finding her.
"Stay there," he said.
"I'll come to you. We'll figure this out together." Michael arrived a few hours later, his face etched with worry. He listened to her story, her reasons for leaving Alessandro, her fears for her safety. "You did the right thing, Isabella," he said. You can't stay with him. He's dangerous. But he loves me, she said, her voice filled with a lingering doubt. He would never hurt me. Michael shook his head. He's obsessed with you, Isabella, he said. He sees you as his possession. He's capable of anything. He offered her a place to stay, a safe house, a secret location where Alessandro wouldn't be able to find her. It was a small apartment owned by a friend of his, a woman who worked for a domestic violence shelter. It's not much, he said, but it's safe. And you can stay there as long as you need to. Isabella gratefully accepted his offer. She knew that she couldn't stay at the motel, that Alessandro would eventually find her there. She needed a safe place, a place where she could hide, regroup, and plan her next move. Michael drove her to the apartment, a small, unassuming building in a quiet residential neighborhood. The apartment was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable. It had a small kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. It was a haven, a refuge from the storm. Thank you, Michael, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know what I would do without you. He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. You're not alone, Isabella, he said. I'm here for you. We'll get through this together. He stayed with her for a while, helping her settle in, making sure she had everything she needed. He brought her groceries, toiletries, and a few books to read. He promised to check on her regularly, to provide her with any support she needed. As he was leaving, he turned to her, his expression serious. You need to be careful, Isabella, he said. Alessandro won't give up easily. He'll be looking for you. I know, she said. But I won't go back to him. I can't. He nodded, understanding. Just be careful, he repeated. And call me if you need anything. Anything at all. He left, leaving Isabella alone in the silence of her new sanctuary. She felt a sense of relief, of safety, but also a profound sense of loneliness. She was free from Alessandro, free from the Mafia, but she was also alone, adrift in a world she didn't know. She sat down on the small sofa, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She thought about Alessandro, his love, his obsession, his dangerous world. She thought about Michael, his kindness, his compassion, his offer of a different life. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to be strong, to be brave, to fight for her freedom, for her happiness. She had to find a way to escape the shadows of her past, to build a new life, a life free from violence and fear. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She knew who it would be, and debated answering. She decided she had to, hoping she could reason with him.
Alessandro.
She answered. Isabella, his voice was a desperate plea. Where are you? I'm not telling you, she replied. I need you to understand, Alessandro. It's over. It's not over, he shouted. I love you. I'll change, I promise. His words, his desperation, touched her, but she remained firm. It's too late, Alessandro, she told him. You can't change. I can't go back. He was silent for a moment. She could hear his rapid breathing. Please, he begged. Just tell me where you are. Let me see you. One last time. She hesitated. The thought of seeing him again, the pull she still felt towards him, were strong.
No, Alessandro, she said.
It's over.
Goodbye.
She hung up the phone, before he could try and change her mind. Tears streamed down her face, but she felt sure of her choice. She was free. But for how long? Chapter 16. The Cost of Freedom. Isabella tried to settle into her new life, her secret life, in the small apartment Michael had secured for her. She spent her days reading, writing, and trying to find a sense of normalcy, a sense of peace, away from the chaos and violence of her past. She kept in touch with Michael, who visited her regularly, bringing her news from the foundation, offering her support and encouragement. She learned that the foundation was thriving, continuing to provide vital services to the community, a testament to her vision, her determination to make a difference. But she couldn't escape the fear, the constant anxiety that gnawed at her. She knew that Alessandro wouldn't give up, that he would be searching for her, that he would use all his power and influence to find her. She jumped at every noise, every shadow, every unexpected phone call. She had nightmares, vivid dreams filled with images of Alessandro, his face a mixture of anger and hurt, his golden eyes blazing with a desperate plea. She tried to focus on the future, on building a new life for herself, a life free from the mafia, from violence and fear. She started to look for a job, a way to support herself, to become independent, to reclaim her identity. She considered going back to school, finishing her degree, pursuing her passion for literature. But the past continued to haunt her. She received anonymous phone calls, hang-ups, threats. She saw strange cars parked outside her apartment building, men watching her from a distance. She knew that Alessandro was closing in, that it was only a matter of time before he found her. One evening, as she was returning home from a job interview, she was grabbed from behind, a hand clamped over her mouth, a strong arm pulling her into a dark alley. She struggled, fighting against her attacker, but he was too strong. She saw his face, a face she recognized. It was one of Alessandro's men, a man she had seen at the villa, a man who had always been loyal to Alessandro. "He wants to see you," the man said, his voice gruff. "He's not going to hurt you. He just wants to talk." Isabella knew that it was a lie, that Alessandro wouldn't just want to talk. He was obsessed with her, possessive, and he wouldn't let her go easily. She had to escape, to find help. She bit down hard on the man's hand, drawing blood. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip. She kicked him hard in the groin, and he doubled over, groaning. She broke free, running as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran through the streets, dodging pedestrians, weaving through traffic, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. She saw a police car parked on a corner, and she ran towards it, waving her arms, screaming for help. The officers, two young men, looked at her with surprise, then concern. "Help me," she cried. "I'm being followed. He's going to kill me." The officers listened to her story, her frantic explanation of her past, her relationship with Alessandro, her fear for her life. They were skeptical, hesitant, but they agreed to take her to the station, to file a report. At the station, she was questioned for hours, interrogated by detectives, her story scrutinized, her credibility questioned. She told them everything about Alessandro's power, his influence, his control over the city. She told them about the threats, the violence, the murders. But the detectives were dismissive, unconvinced. They knew about Alessandro Bianchi, they knew about his famiglia, but they also knew that he had connections, that he was untouchable. "We can't do anything, ma'am," one of the detectives said, his voice apologetic but firm. "We don't have any evidence. It's your word against his." Isabella was devastated, desperate. She had nowhere to turn, no one to help her. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare, with no escape. She left the station, feeling defeated, hopeless. She knew that Alessandro would find her, that he would take her back, that he would never let her go. As she walked out onto the street, she saw a familiar figure standing across the street, watching her. It was Michael, his face etched with worry. "Isabella," he called, running towards her. "Are you all right? What happened?" She told him about the attack, about the police, about her despair. He listened, his expression grim. "I knew this would happen," he said. "Alessandro won't stop. He'll never let you go." He took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Come with me," he said. "I know a place where you'll be safe. A place where he'll never find you." He led her to his car, and they drove away, leaving the city behind, heading towards an unknown destination, a place where Isabella hoped she could finally find peace, freedom, and a life free from the shadows of the mafia. The cost of freedom, she realized, was high, a constant battle against the forces of darkness, a never-ending struggle to escape the past. But she was determined to fight, to survive, to build a new life for herself, a life worthy of her dreams. She was unsure where they were headed, but anywhere felt better than here. She looked at Michael, and he gave a grim smile. Chapter 17. Shadows of the Past return. Michael drove Isabella to a secluded cabin in the mountains, a remote hideaway far from the city, far from Alessandro's reach. The cabin was small and rustic, but cozy and comfortable, with a fireplace, a wood-burning stove, and a view of the snow-capped peaks. It was a place of peace and tranquility, a refuge from the storm that had engulfed her life. "This is my family's cabin," Michael explained.
No one knows about it.
"You'll be safe here." Isabella felt a sense of relief, of gratitude, wash over her. She was safe for now, hidden away in this remote sanctuary, protected by Michael's kindness and compassion. They spent the next few days settling into the cabin, adjusting to their new surroundings, trying to find a sense of normalcy, a sense of peace. They cooked meals together, read books by the fire, and talked for hours, sharing their stories, their dreams, their fears. Isabella learned more about Michael, his past, his motivations, his unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood, witnessed violence and poverty firsthand, and dedicated his life to helping those in need. He was a good man, a kind man, and Isabella found herself increasingly drawn to him, attracted to his gentle strength, his unwavering support. But even in this remote haven, she couldn't escape the shadows of her past. She had nightmares, vivid dreams filled with images of Alessandro, his face a mixture of anger and hurt, his golden eyes blazing with a desperate plea. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her body trembling. She knew that Alessandro wouldn't give up, that he would be searching for her, that he would use all his power and influence to find her. She was constantly on edge, looking over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected noise. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Michael turned to her, his expression serious. "You know he's going to find you, Isabella," he said. "He's not going to let you go." Isabella nodded, her heart heavy with dread.
I know, she said.
"But I can't go back to him." "I won't."
There's only one way to stop him, Michael said.
"You have to expose him. You have to tell the world what he's done." Isabella hesitated. It was a dangerous proposition, a risky gamble that could put her life in even greater danger. But she also knew that it was the only way to truly be free, to escape Alessandro's grasp forever.
"I don't know," she said. "I'm afraid."
"I'll be with you," Michael said. "I'll protect you. We'll do it together." They began to make plans, gathering evidence, contacting journalists, preparing to expose Alessandro's crimes, his corruption, his violence. They knew that it would be a long and difficult battle, a fight against a powerful and ruthless enemy. But they were determined to see it through, to bring Alessandro to justice, to finally break free from the shadows of the Mafia. As they were working on their plan, gathering documents, making phone calls, a sudden noise outside the cabin startled them. It was a snapping twig, a rustle of leaves, a sign that someone was out there, watching them. Michael grabbed a shotgun from beside the fireplace, his face grim.
"Stay here," he said to Isabella.
"And don't make a sound." He crept towards the door, his movements slow and deliberate, the shotgun held ready. He peered through the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. He saw a figure standing in the shadows, a tall, imposing figure with golden eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. It was Alessandro. Michael opened the door, stepping outside, the shotgun pointed at Alessandro. "Get off my property, Bianchi," he said, his voice cold and hard. Alessandro smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. "I've come for Isabella," he said, his voice calm and unwavering.
"She's not going with you," Michael said.
"She doesn't want to see you." Alessandro's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury.
"She belongs with me," he said.
"She's mine."
"She's not yours," Michael said.
"She's a person, not a possession. And she's made her choice." Alessandro took a step forward, his hand reaching inside his coat. "I'm not leaving without her," he said. Michael raised the shotgun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't make me do this, Bianchi," he said. Isabella, watching from inside the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest, knew that a confrontation was inevitable. She had to do something to stop the violence, to prevent bloodshed. She stepped outside, standing between Michael and Alessandro, her body a fragile shield.
Stop, she cried.
Don't do this. There's been enough violence. Alessandro looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of love and desperation. Isabella, he said, his voice pleading.
Come home. Come back to me.
I can't, Alessandro, she said, her voice trembling.
I won't go back to that life.
It's over.
It's not over, he said.
I'll never let you go. You're mine forever. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, his eyes pleading. But Isabella stepped back, shaking her head. The shadows of the past were closing in, threatening to engulf her once again. And she knew that she had to make a choice, a final, definitive choice that would determine her future, her freedom, her very survival. She braced herself. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 18. A love rekindled. Isabella looked at Alessandro, his face a mixture of desperation and determination, his golden eyes pleading with her. She felt a pang of sympathy, a flicker of the love she had once felt for him, but she knew she couldn't go back. She couldn't return to the darkness, the violence, the control. Alessandro, she said, her voice firm but gentle. Please, let me go. It's over. We can't go back to the way things were. He shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. I can't lose you, Isabella, he said. You're everything to me. I'll do anything, change anything just to have you back. You can't change Alessandro, she said. Not really. It's in your blood, in your past. It's who you are. Michael stepped forward, his hand on Isabella's arm, a silent offer of support. Leave her alone, Bianchi, he said. She's made her choice. Alessandro glared at Michael, his eyes filled with hatred. This is none of your business, he said. She belongs with me. She doesn't belong to anyone, Isabella said, her voice rising. I'm my own person, and I choose to be free. Alessandro's face crumpled, his bravado fading, replaced by a look of utter despair. He looked at Isabella, his eyes searching hers, pleading for a glimmer of hope, a sign that she still loved him. And in that moment, Isabella realized that she did still love him, in a way. She loved the boy he had been, the man he could have been, the dream of a life together they had once shared. But she couldn't love the man he had become, the man trapped by his past, by his violence, by his obsession. I'm sorry, Alessandro, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I truly am, but I can't go back. I have to move on. Alessandro stood there, frozen, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on Isabella. He looked like a broken man, a man defeated, his world shattered. Then, slowly, he lowered his head, his shoulders slumping, his fight gone. I understand, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest, leaving Isabella and Michael standing there, alone in the silence of the night. Isabella felt a wave of relief, but also a profound sadness. She had finally broken free from Alessandro, from the Mafia, but it had come at a cost. She had lost a part of herself, a part of her heart, a dream of a love that could never be. Michael put his arm around her, drawing her close, offering her comfort and support. It's over, he said. You're free. Isabella leaned against him, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She was free, but the scars of the past remained, a constant reminder of the pain, the loss, the violence she had endured. They returned to the cabin, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Isabella felt a sense of gratitude towards Michael for his kindness, his compassion, his unwavering support. But she also felt a sense of confusion, of uncertainty about her future. As they sat by the fire, Michael turned to her, his expression gentle. What will you do now? He asked. Isabella sighed, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. I don't know, she said. I need to rebuild my life, find a new purpose, a new direction. You can stay here, Michael said. As long as you need to. We can figure it out together. Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine care, the offer of a new beginning. Thank you, Michael, she said. For everything. He smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that made her heart flutter.
"You don't need to thank me," he said.
"I care about you, Isabella. I want you to be happy." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a light, tentative touch that sent a shiver through her. She leaned into his touch, seeking comfort in his presence, in his warmth. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, gentle kiss that spoke of tenderness, of understanding, of a new beginning. It was a kiss that acknowledged the pain of the past, but also offered the hope of a brighter future. Isabella responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She kissed him back, with a tentative hope, a cautious exploration of a new emotion, a new possibility. It wasn't the passionate, fiery love she had felt for Alessandro, the love that had consumed her, dominated her, almost destroyed her. It was a different kind of love, a gentler, more compassionate love, a love built on trust, on respect, on shared values. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. Isabella saw a future in Michael's eyes, a future free from violence, from fear, from the shadows of the Mafia. It was a future filled with hope, with peace, with the possibility of a new love, a love that could heal the scars of the past. She smiled, a tentative, fragile smile, but a smile that spoke of a new beginning, a new chapter in her life. She had found her freedom, and now, perhaps, she had found a new love, a love that could help her rebuild her life, find her purpose, and finally escape the darkness that had haunted her for so long. It was a quiet love, a cautious love. But maybe, just maybe, it was the love she deserved all along. It was a love rekindled from the ashes of despair. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. Life at the cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm. Isabella and Michael spent their days working on the foundation remotely, using Michael's contacts and resources to continue their mission of helping those in need. They took long walks in the woods, cooked meals together, and talked late into the night, sharing their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Isabella found a sense of calm, of contentment, she hadn't experienced in years. She was healing, slowly but surely, from the trauma of her past, finding solace in Michael's gentle presence, his unwavering support. But the outside world, the world of the Mafia, continued to intrude. They received news that Alessandro had retreated, withdrawn from the Famiglia, leaving Rico in charge. He had become a recluse, a shadow of his former self, consumed by grief and regret. Isabella felt a pang of sympathy for Alessandro, a lingering sadness for the lost potential, the love that could never be. But she knew that she had made the right decision, that she couldn't go back, that she had to move forward. One day, they received a visit from an unexpected guest, Rico, Alessandro's former lieutenant, the man now in charge of the Famiglia. Isabella was apprehensive, fearful, but Michael assured her that Rico was not a threat, that he had come in peace. Rico arrived at the cabin, his face weathered and weary, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and respect. He greeted Isabella politely, acknowledging her decision to leave Alessandro, expressing his regret for the past. "I came to tell you that Alessandro is gone," Rico said, his voice low. "He left the city, left the Famiglia. He's gone back to Italy, to the village where he grew up." Isabella felt a wave of relief, mixed with a lingering sadness. Alessandro was finally out of her life, no longer a threat, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, a sense of mourning for the man he had once been. "He left you a letter," Rico said, handing Isabella a sealed envelope. "He wanted you to have it." Isabella took the letter, her hands trembling. She recognized Alessandro's handwriting, the familiar script that had once filled her with both excitement and dread. Rico continued, "He also instructed me to ensure your safety, to protect you and the Foundation. The Famiglia will no longer interfere with your work. You have my word." Isabella looked at Rico, her eyes searching his face. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse, the commitment to a different path. She knew that she could trust him, that he was a man of his word. "Thank you, Rico," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Rico nodded, his expression somber. Alessandro, he made mistakes, he said. But he loved you, Isabella. He truly did. He turned and left, disappearing into the woods, leaving Isabella and Michael alone with Alessandro's letter, a final message from the past. Isabella opened the letter, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to read, Alessandro's words unfolding before her, a testament to his love, his regret, his final farewell. Isabella, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I have left New York, left the famiglia, left the life that brought us both so much pain. I have gone back to Italy, to the place where I was born, to try and find some peace, some redemption. I know I have hurt you, betrayed you, caused you unimaginable pain. I can never forgive myself for the choices I made, for the darkness I brought into your life. I was blinded by my past, by my obsession with you, by my desire for revenge. I loved you, Isabella, more than anything in the world. I still do. But I know that my love was a destructive force, a poison that threatened to destroy you. I had to let you go, to set you free, to allow you to find happiness, even if it meant losing you forever. I know you have found someone else, Michael. He seems like a good man, a man who can give you the life you deserve, a life free from violence and fear. I hope you will be happy with him. I have instructed Rico to protect you, to ensure your safety, to support the foundation. I hope that the foundation can be a force for good, a way to atone for the sins of our families, a legacy of hope for the future. I will never forget you, Isabella. You will always be in my heart, a reminder of the love I lost, the life I could have had. I hope that one day you can forgive me, but even if you can't, I understand. Goodbye, my love. Alessandro, Isabella finished reading the letter, tears streaming down her face. It was a farewell, a confession, a plea for forgiveness. It was the final chapter in their story, a story of love and loss, of violence and redemption. She felt a profound sadness for Alessandro, for the life he had lost, for the choices he had made. But she also felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace. He was finally gone, out of her life, and she could move forward, free from the shadows of the past. She looked at Michael, his face filled with understanding and compassion. He took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. It's over, Isabella, he said. You're truly free now. Isabella nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She was free, free to rebuild her life, free to find happiness, free to create a future worthy of her dreams. The reckoning had come, the past had been laid to rest, and a new chapter had begun. The sun started to set, painting the room in hues of orange. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Despite Alessandro's departure and Rico's assurances, Isabella couldn't entirely shake the feeling of unease. The world she had inhabited for so long, a world of hidden threats and sudden betrayals, had left its mark. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her senses heightened, anticipating danger even in the tranquility of the mountain cabin. Michael, ever perceptive, noticed her lingering anxiety. He's gone, Isabella, he reassured her one evening as they sat by the fireplace. Rico is a man of his word. You're safe now. I know, Isabella said, forcing a smile. It's just old habits die hard, I suppose. But it wasn't just old habits. It was a nagging intuition, a whisper in the back of her mind that told her the story wasn't quite over. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a lingering connection to Alessandro, a sense that their paths would cross again, one last time. Her intuition proved correct. A week later, a sleek black car, unmistakably belonging to the famiglia, appeared on the winding road leading to the cabin. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed Michael's arm, her eyes wide with fear. It can't be, she whispered. Rico promised Michael, his face grim, reached for the shotgun he kept by the door. Stay inside, he instructed. I'll handle this. But as the car drew closer, Isabella recognized the driver. It wasn't Rico. It was Lorenzo Moretti, her father, his face aged and gaunt, but his eyes still burning with a familiar intensity. Isabella was stunned. She had believed her father to be neutralized, stripped of his power, his influence, his will to fight. What was he doing here? Before Michael could react, Isabella ran outside, placing herself between the car and the cabin. "Father," she exclaimed, "what are you doing here?" Lorenzo stepped out of the car, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked at Isabella, his expression a mixture of anger, regret, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "I came to warn you, Isabella," he said, his voice raspy. "About Alessandro." Isabella frowned.
Alessandro is gone, she said.
"He's in Italy." Lorenzo shook his head.
He's not gone, he said.
"He's coming back. And he's not coming back for you, Isabella. He's coming back for revenge." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't want to believe her father. The man who had lied to her, manipulated her, used her for his own gain. But she couldn't ignore the urgency in his voice, the fear in his eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. Lorenzo explained that Alessandro had been secretly communicating with elements within the Famiglia who were still loyal to him, plotting a return, a violent takeover of the organization. He had learned of Alessandro's plans through his own remaining contacts, his spies who still operated within the underworld. "He's not the man you think he is, Isabella," Lorenzo said. "He's a monster, consumed by hatred and a thirst for power. He'll destroy everything you've built, everything you believe in." Isabella felt a wave of confusion, of doubt, wash over her. Could her father be telling the truth? Could Alessandro be capable of such deception, such violence? She had seen glimpses of his darkness, his ruthlessness, but she had also believed in his capacity for change, for redemption. Michael stepped forward, his hand on Isabella's arm. "Don't listen to him, Isabella," he said. "He's trying to manipulate you, to turn you against Alessandro." Lorenzo glared at Michael. "This is family business," he said. "Stay out of it." "Isabella is not your family anymore," Michael retorted. "She's free from you, from all of you." Lorenzo turned back to Isabella, his eyes pleading. "I know I've made mistakes, Isabella," he said. "I know I've hurt you, but I'm your father, and I'm telling you the truth. Alessandro is dangerous. You need to get away from here before it's too late." Isabella was torn. She didn't know who to believe, who to trust. Her father, the man who had betrayed her, or Alessandro, the man who had loved her, but also lied to her. And Michael. She couldn't put him in danger. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. Lorenzo gasped, clutching his chest, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He stumbled backward, collapsing to the ground. Isabella screamed, rushing to her father's side. Michael, his face a mask of fury, raised the shotgun, searching for the shooter. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged, a tall, imposing figure with golden eyes that gleamed in the fading light. It was Alessandro. He held a smoking gun in his hand, his face a mixture of triumph and regret.
"Alessandro,"
Isabella cried, her voice a mixture of shock, disbelief, and horror. "What have you done?" Alessandro looked at Isabella, his expression unreadable. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He had come back, not for revenge, but to eliminate the last remaining threat to his power, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had tried to destroy him, his former mentor, his lover's father, Lorenzo Moretti. It was the final confrontation, the ultimate betrayal, the culmination of a lifetime of lies, of violence, of twisted loyalties. Isabella's world had come crashing down around her, the truth revealed in a single, brutal act. She stared at him and realized she did not know this man. Epilogue. The aftermath of Lorenzo's death was a blur of chaos and grief. Michael, despite his shock and anger, acted quickly, calling the authorities and ensuring Isabella's safety. Alessandro, surprisingly, didn't resist arrest. He surrendered peacefully, his face a mask of weary resignation, as if he had finally accepted the consequences of his actions. The news of Lorenzo's murder and Alessandro's arrest sent shockwaves through the city, shattering the fragile peace that had been established. The famiglia, leaderless and fractured, descended into internal conflict, a power struggle that threatened to plunge the city back into darkness. Isabella, numb with grief and betrayal, retreated from the world, seeking solace in the quiet solitude of the mountain cabin. Michael stayed by her side, offering his unwavering support, his gentle presence a constant source of comfort. She mourned her father, despite his flaws, his lies, his manipulative nature. She mourned the loss of the dream she had once shared with Alessandro, the dream of a life together, a life free from violence and fear. She mourned the loss of innocence, the shattering of illusions, the brutal awakening to the reality of the world she had tried so hard to escape. In the weeks that followed, Isabella made a difficult decision. She decided to testify against Alessandro, to expose his crimes, to bring him to justice, to finally break the cycle of violence that had consumed their families for generations. It was a dangerous decision, a risky gamble, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She couldn't remain silent, couldn't allow Alessandro's actions to go unpunished. She had to speak out, to stand up for what she believed in, to fight for a better future. The trial was a media sensation, a public spectacle that captivated the city. Isabella, despite her fear and vulnerability, stood strong, her testimony clear and unwavering. She recounted her story, her relationship with Alessandro, his descent into darkness, his betrayal, his ultimate act of violence. Alessandro, sitting in the defendant's chair, watched her with a mixture of sadness and respect. He didn't deny his crimes, didn't try to defend himself. He accepted his fate, his punishment, with a quiet dignity that surprised everyone. He was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison, his reign of power and terror finally brought to an end. After the trial, Isabella returned to the mountain cabin, seeking peace and healing. She spent her days walking in the woods, reading by the fire and reflecting on her life, her choices, her future. She knew that the scars of the past would always be with her, a constant reminder of the pain, the loss, the violence she had endured. But she also knew that she was stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever before. She continued to work with the foundation, dedicating her life to helping others, to creating a world free from violence and fear. She found solace in her work, in the positive impact she was having on the community, in the hope she was inspiring in others. Michael remained by her side, his love and support unwavering. He understood her pain, her grief, her determination to move forward. He offered her a different kind of love, a gentle, compassionate love, a love built on trust, on respect, on shared values. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Isabella turned to Michael, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude.
"Thank you," she said.
"For everything." Michael smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that made her heart flutter.
"You don't need to thank me," he said.
"I'm here for you, Isabella. Always." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a light, tender touch that spoke of a future filled with hope, with peace, with the possibility of a new love. Isabella leaned into his touch, her heart filled with a quiet contentment. She had lost so much, endured so much pain, but she had also found something precious, something enduring her freedom, her strength, her purpose. She looked out at the snow-capped mountains, the vast expanse of sky, the quiet beauty of the natural world. She had escaped the darkness, the violence, the shadows of the Mafia. She had found her way to the light, to a new life, a new beginning. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges, obstacles, setbacks. But she was ready. She was strong. She was free. And she was finally at peace. The final confrontation had been brutal, devastating. She would never forget the look on Alessandro's face. But it was over. She was safe.
She was free.
And with Michael by her side, she knew that she could face anything.